Okay, let's start with the basics. Humans are made up of trillions of cells, and we have at least a couple of hundred different types of cells: nerve cells, muscle cells, epithelial cells, and in each of our cells we have these. Now this is my very crude model of a chromosome. Chromosomes are thread-like structures found in the nucleus that contain our DNA. On this model of a chromosome I have here, this part here is meant to represent the centromere, which has a particularly important role during cell division. And this part is the short arm of the chromosome, and here is the long arm of the chromosome. And in each of our cells, we actually have 46 of these, because we get one set of 23 chromosomes from our mum and one set of 23 chromosomes from our dad. And so each chromosome contains one long string of DNA with lots and lots of packaging proteins. So on my model here, if I started to pull out on this along this string here, I wouldn't be down to the level of DNA yet, because that would be more akin to a chromatin fiber, and DNA is smaller still. However, if I continued to tease it out more and more, eventually I would get down to the level of DNA. And that's what this picture is meant to show here. You can see that as you tease out a chromosome further and further, you get down to the level of DNA wrapped around ball-shaped proteins called histones. Now, like I said, we have 46 of these in most of our cells because we have 23 pairs. And I actually think it's quite remarkable to think just how much DNA we have spread across those 23 pairs of chromosomes. I like the way the British geneticist Kadani describes it. She says it this way: every single cell in your body contains more than 2 meters, 6.5 feet of DNA. Yes, you read that right, 2 meters. It's absolutely staggering. Probably one of my favorite science facts right there. Kadani goes on to say, once you realize that these 2 meters have to be packaged up and shoved into the cell's nucleus, a structure half the width of a human hair, it becomes immediately clear that portraying DNA and genes as purely two-dimensional linear entities is nonsense. Now, part of the reason she describes portraying DNA as a linear two-dimensional entity is nonsense is because DNA is packaged in a three-dimensional form, and that three-dimensional form influences how DNA is expressed. We really need to think about DNA as a three-dimensional entity. But it's even more complicated than that, because DNA doesn't stay in a static 3D form. That form changes over time. For one thing, chromosomes are not always in this condensed form. At other times, they take on this form when a cell is about to divide, but at other times, they are more spread out in the nucleus. While recognizing this complexity, I still want to go back to thinking about DNA in its simplest form. So DNA is a double-stranded molecule that conveys genetic information according to the sequence of 4 different chemical bases, which essentially serve as chemical letters. The English alphabet, of course, has 26 letters. The DNA alphabet only has 4. And these 4 letters are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. But we simply abbreviate them A, T, C, and G. So by reading the chemical letters of DNA spread across your chromosomes, you could theoretically read the entire human genome. And that's what the human genome is, the entirety of DNA spread across one set of human chromosomes. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to read you the human genome. Well, not the entire human genome, just the start of it. Just the start of chromosome number 1. So make yourself comfortable. Here we go. TC, GC, GG, TA, CCC, TC, AG, etc. Get the picture? If I read you the entire human genome, we would be here for a very long time, because the human genome contains about 3.1 billion DNA letters. And remember, you don't just have one copy of the human genome in most of your cells, because remember, in most of your cells, you don't have one set of 23 chromosomes, you have 23 chromosome pairs. Now, another thing to keep in mind about the human genome is that we don't all have the same 3.1 billion DNA letters. And that's a good thing, because if we did, all humans would be clones and the world would be a much more boring place. However, as a species, humans are remarkably similar to each other in our DNA sequence. It is often said that humans are about 99.9% similar to each other in our DNA sequence. What this means is for every 1,000 DNA letters that you have, you share about 999 of them with a complete stranger and only differ by about one letter out of those 1,000 DNA letters. Now, another thing to keep in mind, though, is there is another form of variation in the sense of copy number variants. And what these are shorter, repetitive sequences found throughout our genome, and individuals can vary in the number of repeats they have, and this is another form of variation between people. But even while recognizing this, humans are still remarkably similar to each other as a species in regards to our DNA. Another thing to consider is, what is a gene? Well, a gene is simply a sequence of DNA that carries specific instructions, usually to make a protein or an RNA molecule. And in the case of the human genome, we have about 20,000 genes in the human genome, or approximately. And I use the word approximately deliberately, because scientists don't know the exact number of genes that we have in the human genome. Now, this might surprise people, thinking, what? Scientists don't know the exact number of genes? Well, part of the reason is because there are no road signs in your genome saying a gene starts here. Remember, the human genome is just a very long sequence of 4 different chemical letters. And so identifying a gene, there's certainly features about a sequence of the DNA that tell scientists it looks like there's a gene here, but interpreting the genome is much harder than just reading the 4 individual letters. Okay, so we've gone down to the level of DNA. Let's go back up to the level of chromosomes. So what I want to do now is I want to show you this schematic here of the first 22 pairs of chromosomes. And it's actually a schematic of my chromosomes. What I did was I did a DNA ancestry test where I sent in a saliva sample, in fact, into a particular company. And though my saliva contained my cells and those cells contain my chromosomes and DNA, and by studying variation in my DNA, this company was able to tell me about my ancestry. And so this schematic of my chromosomes, it's color-coded to reflect my ancestry. Now, at this stage, I don't want to get distracted telling you what the colors mean. I just want to point out a few things about chromosomes generally. So first of all, notice in this first 22 pairs of chromosomes, they go from biggest to smallest. Chromosome 1 is the biggest chromosome. It has the most DNA and the most genes. Chromosome 2 is the second biggest chromosome, and it has the second largest amount of DNA, and then down to chromosome 3, etc., all the way down. So this pattern continues all the way down through the chromosomes. Now, you would think then that chromosome 22 must be the smallest. Well, it's not. Actually, chromosome 21 is a little bit smaller than chromosome 22, but in any case, our first 22 pairs of chromosomes are numbered from 1 to 22 according to size, from biggest to smallest generally. Another thing I want you to notice about these chromosomes is that they come in pairs. The reason they come in pairs is because I got one set of chromosomes from each of my parents. So I got one copy of chromosome 1 from my mum and one copy of chromosome 1 from my dad. I got one copy of chromosome 2 from my mum and one copy of chromosome 2 from my dad. Both of my parents each gave me a copy of chromosome 3, etc., all the way down with these first 22 pairs of chromosomes. So these first 22 pairs of chromosomes are referred to as autosomes. However, humans don't have 22 pairs of chromosomes. We actually have 23. We also have a pair of sex chromosomes, and these are the ones that are particularly pertinent to the discussion at hand. And so when it comes to the sex chromosomes, you have two options. The first of these is the X chromosome. Now, this chromosome has about 800 to 900 genes, and to say the X chromosome is important is an understatement because the X chromosome is critically important. Human life is not compatible without at least one copy of the X chromosome. If a fertilized egg does not contain an X chromosome, it won't develop any further. And when we consider the genes on the X chromosome, this is how the geneticist Edwin Kirk describes the situation. The X chromosome is large and packed with important genes, including many that are essential for the way the brain develops and thus for intelligence. So it's no surprise then that we need at least one copy of the X chromosome. The other sex chromosome is the Y chromosome. Now, this chromosome is much smaller. It contains less than 200 genes, and some researchers actually put the gene count as closer to 50. And among other things, it has a number of genes associated with sperm production. Now, that is a very, very big hint as to whether this chromosome is more relevant to males or females. So remember, our chromosomes come in pairs, and that means our sex chromosomes also come in pairs. So in the case of females, they have 2 X chromosomes, or about 99.85% of females have 2 X chromosomes. And in the case of males, they have an X and a Y chromosome, or about 99.75% of males have an X and a Y chromosome. So let's go through some examples of how this works. Let's look at a couple of sets of human chromosomes. In the first image here, I have a set of human chromosomes. There's 23 pairs. Notice they go from roughly biggest to smallest of the first 22 pairs, the autosomes. And then we have a pair of sex chromosomes, which are circled in red. Now notice, in this case here, we have 2 X chromosomes. So in this instance here, we have a set of chromosomes from someone who is female. Okay, let's look at an alternative. So once again, here's another set of human chromosomes. And you'll notice that once again, there's 23 pairs, 22 pairs of autosomes, and a pair of sex chromosomes. But in this instance, we have 1 X and 1 Y. Now here we have an example of a set of chromosomes from a male. Now, one of the things I want you to realize is that this XY system is much, much bigger than just humans. It's actually mammal-wide. Now, I want to show you a recent interesting quote from New Scientist magazine. In fact, it's a quote from a few years ago, and admittedly, you can look at the title of this article, and it is a little quirky. It says, where it mentions about this rat from Japan, a rat without a Y chromosome could be a glimpse of our genetic future. Now, this is a very intriguing case about a species of rat from Japan. It's a very interesting teaching tool. I want to go back to it later, but for the moment, I don't want to get distracted by this rat at the moment, but I promise to come back to it. What I want to do is focus on a more general quote from this article. This is what they say in New Scientist from a couple of years ago. There are many different sex-determining systems across the animal kingdom, but in virtually all mammals, sex depends on the X and Y chromosomes. If an embryo inherits 2 X chromosomes, it develops into a female. If it inherits an X and a Y, it becomes male. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, those last 2 sentences sound awfully familiar. I'm going to read them again. If an embryo inherits 2 X chromosomes, it develops into a female. If it inherits an X and a Y, it becomes male. Now, the reason that sounds familiar is because it's exactly the same as what we find in humans. So, let's go through some examples. Let's start off with my dogs, Rocky and Ava. Now, dogs have 39 pairs of chromosomes. they have 38 pairs of autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Rocky, being a boy, he has an X and a Y sex chromosome, whereas Ava is female and she has 2 X chromosomes. But hey, maybe you are not a dog person, maybe you're a cat person. Well, whether we're talking about household cats or big cats like lions, tigers and leopards, they actually have 19 pairs of chromosomes. So they have 18 pairs of autosomes, 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Male cats are XY and female cats are XX. Let's go through a couple more examples. So take, for example, mice. They have 20 pairs of chromosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Male mice are XY and female mice have 2 X chromosomes. And how about chimpanzees? Well, chimpanzees have 24 pairs of chromosomes and they have 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Male chimps are XY, they have an X and a Y sex chromosome, and female chimps have 2 X chromosomes. So you see, different mammals have different numbers of chromosomes, so they package their DNA in different ways. However, they have the XY sex determining system just like us. And it's not just land-dwelling mammals either that are based on this system. Consider dolphins. Now, they might be swimming around in the ocean, but they are mammals too. And in the case of dolphins, they have 22 pairs of chromosomes. They have and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Male dolphins have an X and a Y sex chromosome, and female dolphins have 2 X chromosomes. Isn't it great when you're seeing these consistent patterns in the data in science? But it would be a mistake to think that all animals are like this, because that is certainly not the case. Take, for example, turtles. Now, turtles actually have a temperature-dependent sex-determining system. So what this means is that when buried eggs are incubated at lower temperatures, male development proceeds. However, if the eggs are incubated at a higher temperature, female development proceeds. Now, if that was the case in humans, that would be rather quirky, because what you would find, for instance, in the east coast of Australia, you would find more males would be born in the cooler states like Victoria and Tasmania, and more females would be born in a warmer state like Queensland. I don't know what that means. I guess everyone would meet halfway in New South Wales. But of course, we don't have a temperature-dependent sex-determining system. We have one based on the XY system. Another example is alligators. Now, alligators also have a temperature-dependent sex-determining system, but in their case, it's a little bit different because with alligators, there seems to be this middle band of 32 to 33 degrees where if eggs are incubated at that temperature, male development proceeds, but if it's significantly above or below that, female development proceeds. But of course, you are not an alligator. You are not a turtle. You are a mammal. Now, I would contend that you are a rather unique and remarkable mammal, but you're a mammal nonetheless. And as a mammal, you have a chromosomal XY sex-determining system. Now, earlier I mentioned that most of our cells have 23 pairs of chromosomes. One notable exception to this is our reproductive cells. Men in their sperm and females in their eggs only have 1 set of chromosomes. And there's a good reason for this, because at the point of conception, a unique individual is formed with 2 sets of chromosomes. If males in their sperm and females in their eggs had 2 sets of chromosomes, at the point of conception, you'd have 4 sets of chromosomes, and that wouldn't work. So what this means is for a female in her eggs, she'll have 1 copy of chromosome 1, 1 copy of chromosome 2, 1 copy of chromosome 3, all the way down to chromosome 22 and 1 sex chromosome. Likewise, for a male in his sperm, he'll have 1 copy of chromosome 1, 1 copy of chromosome 2, 1 copy of chromosome 3, all the way down to 22, and also 1 sex chromosome. However, I want you to think more specifically about the sex chromosomes and the relative contribution to the next generation. Let's just put those first 22 pairs of autosomes to one side for the moment and think about the sex chromosomes. Both males and females will only pass on one sex chromosome. And in the case of females, they only have one option. They can only pass on an X chromosome. Whereas in the case of males, they will only pass on one sex chromosome too, but they have two options. They can either pass on an X or they can pass on a Y. And what the male passes on actually dictates the sex of the baby. So for instance, if a man passes on an X chromosome, well, the female has already passed on an X, so you'll have an individual that's XX and female development will proceed. However, if the man passes on a Y chromosome and the female passes on an X chromosome, you'll have an individual that's XY and male development will proceed. So that's why this cartoon, it might look a little quirky, but it actually conveys a very important scientific point. You see, the lady is very angry, she's quite incensed, and she says to the man, "I thought we agreed we wanted a sweet little girl, but you and your stupid Y chromosome messed everything up." And you see the man there sitting there looking rather dumbfounded, not knowing what to say. Now, it is a little bit quirky, but it does make a very important scientific point, and that is that what the male passes on will dictate whether male or female development proceeds. In this case here, presumably, she wanted him to pass on an X chromosome, but he passed on a Y and they had a boy instead. So we've covered a lot of territory here, and I want to summarize what I've gone through so far by quoting a scientific heavyweight. I don't just want you to believe what I've said, I want to substantiate it by quoting a scientific heavyweight. And in the case of genetics, there's perhaps no bigger scientific heavyweight than this man here, James Watson. Now, James Watson was one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA, and he won a Nobel Prize for this, and he co-discovered the structure of DNA in 1953 when he was in his mid-20s, believe it or not. And ever since that point in time, he has been at the forefront of genetic research. At one stage, he was the head of the Human Genome Project. And this is a quote from a book he co-authored not that long ago, back in 2017. So this is what James Watson said. "The male-specific component of the genome is, of course, the Y chromosome. By definition, the possessor of a Y is male." Now, I want to stop there for a moment and just remember what he said there. By definition, the possessor of the Y is male. Now, at this point in this book, he doesn't qualify it or add to it or have anything more to say about that. At a later stage, I actually want to qualify it and add some little caveats, but at this stage, I just want to take it at face value. The possessor of the Y is male. Let's go back to the rest of the quote. He says this: "The sperm determines our sex because the egg cell always contains an X chromosome. XX combinations produce females and XY males. The Y chromosome then holds the key to the genetic history of men." So, we've covered a lot of territory, we've covered the basics, but we need to go a bit deeper because, as many people correctly point out, not all humans have 46 chromosomes. Sometimes humans vary in the number of chromosomes they have, and they can also vary in the number of sex chromosomes they have too. And we're going to look at that in the next section.